Susan Brady has been working at a prestigious hospital for over 10 years. She is an exemplary nurse, always calm, friendly, and impeccably diligent in her duties. Patients trust her, and colleagues consider her almost saintly. Susan often stays late, saving people from death, and has even received several awards for her conscientious work. But no one suspects that something sinister lies behind her mask. One morning, when Laura, the new nurse, started her first shift, she was greeted by Susan's friendly face. Susan gave her a tour of the medical wing and immediately took her under her wing. At first glance, Susan seemed kind-hearted. But by the end of the day, Laura felt something strange. All the patients excessively praised Susan but appeared exhausted and terrified. That evening, they received a call. 74-year-old patient Henry had suffered a cardiac arrest. Laura rushed to help, but Susan stopped her with a casual hand gesture. "Don't fuss, he doesn't have much of a chance," she said calmly, as if it were just another routine matter. Laura watched in shock as Susan leisurely prepared the defibrillator, donned gloves, and checked the time. The few seconds felt like hours. The patient, gasping for air, was growing paler. Laura lunged forward. "Let me help," but Susan just smiled. "Don't rush. Sometimes the best help is to give them peace." Laura froze, unsure of what to do. And in that moment, she saw Susan gently remove the oxygen mask from Henry's face. The patient gasped for a few more seconds, his eyes wide with panic, before he stilled. Laura stood frozen, unable to say anything. Susan covered the body with a sheet, betraying no emotion. "You'll quickly learn to understand that not everyone is worth saving," she said, clearing the instruments. Her voice was soft and even, as if she were explaining something obvious. That evening, Laura couldn't shake the thoughts of what had happened. It seemed too strange, as if Susan had deliberately chosen not to save the patient. When she hinted at this to her colleagues, they simply shrugged it off. "Susan? She's the best. Sometimes people just don't have a chance." The next day, Laura noticed another alarming sign. Henry's medical records had vanished. There was no trace of his history or information about his death in the database. Laura asked Susan about it. "Forget about him," she replied tersely. "Some stories are better left untold." Those words sent a chill down Laura's spine, as if the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees. The more she thought about it, the more it seemed she was dealing with something dark and dangerous. That night, Laura faced another chilling incident. A young man brought in for an overdose was still conscious and begging for help. Laura was about to set up in 4, but Susan stopped her. "Give him some time. If he survives on his own, then he deserves it." "But we have to try to save him," Laura protested. "We owe him nothing. He made his choice." Laura watched as Susan swapped out the medication in the syringe meant to help him. She injected him with something else, and when the man began to convulse in pain, Susan merely watched silently. At that moment, Laura felt as though Susan took some perverse pleasure in his suffering. That night, Laura walked home gripped by horror and doubt. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had witnessed something terrible, yet her mind tried to justify what she had seen. The next morning, the news reported that the man had died from complications. Laura realized she was on the verge of uncovering a horrifying truth. Susan wasn't just indifferent to the lives of patients. She was hiding something, and if Laura continued to dig, it might cost her more than just her job. Every passing day at work became a trial for Laura. She couldn't shake off the strange incidents. The deaths of patients, the manipulation of medications, the missing records. But what frightened her most was Susan's indifference and her cold, unyielding gaze. Laura sensed that behind those eyes lay something truly terrifying. One night during her shift, she decided to take action. Laura began documenting every suspicious detail, which medications Susan administered to patients, how their records mysteriously vanished from the database. She did this carefully, storing all her materials on her tablet. One evening, Laura tried to talk to another nurse to see if she'd noticed anything unusual, but the woman just nervously brushed her off. "I don't know anything, Laura. Stay out of it if you want to stay alive." That response only heightened Laura's anxiety. It seemed everyone was afraid of Susan. A few days later, returning to her office after a short break, she paused at the door as if slapped. Her tablet was missing. Laura frantically searched the entire unit, checking every drawer, every desk, but to no avail. It was as if all the evidence she had gathered had vanished into thin air. Suddenly, when she opened her desk drawer, she froze. The tablet lay inside, and a photo glowed on the screen. Laura felt her hands start to tremble. The picture was of her boyfriend, Jake. He was asleep, wrapped in a blanket at home. Someone had stood over him in the dark and taken this photo on her own device. Her heart raced as she realized. Susan knew everything. She had been in their home, touching their things. Laura felt the world around her collapse. The next morning, Susan approached her during her shift with the same casual smile. "Did you spend a long time looking for your tablet? I hope you found it." Her voice was soft, but there was a hidden threat in every word. Laura tried to remain calm, but Susan leaned in closer and whispered, "Jake sleeps so peacefully, doesn't he? What a shame if someone were to disturb his sleep." Laura froze, feeling a chill run down her spine. "What do you want?" she barely managed to ask. Susan stepped back, smiling again. "Oh, I want nothing. Just a warning. Don't go poking around where you shouldn't." Every word of hers dripped with a calmness that was scarier than any scream. She knew Laura could no longer trust anyone, that fear would paralyze her and render her powerless. In the following days, Susan grew bolder in her games with Laura. Once, Laura found a surgical instrument with dried blood under her jacket. Another time, she discovered an open medical file on her computer screen with Jake's name on it, as if he were a patient. Each of these discoveries was small but eerily suggested that Susan was always one step ahead. She knew everything about Laura, and that knowledge was her weapon. Laura understood that if she tried to expose Susan, it could lead to disaster. No one would believe her, especially if Susan framed her like she had done with others. And now, it was not only her life at stake, but also Jake's safety. Every subsequent shift became unbearable for Laura. She could no longer eat or sleep properly. She felt trapped with no way out. And the worst part was that Susan knew it. Laura sat in the corner of the room with Susan, watching as she calmly sipped her coffee. Each sip seemed to highlight her nonchalance, while Laura felt a growing desire to test this game of trust. She knew it could be dangerous, but something about Susan's philosophy drew her in. "You know," Laura began, trying to sound casual, "I've come to the conclusion that you're right. Sometimes, to save some lives, you have to sacrifice others. This world is cruel, and not everyone deserves a second chance." Susan paused her action and looked at Laura, her eyes flickering with interest. "You think so?" she asked, smiling but with a shadow of distrust. "Many just can't cope with reality." "Yeah," Laura nodded, feeling her heart race. "I think harshness is part of the process. I've always been too soft, and you've shown me that it's not always the right way. I'd like to learn from you, to understand your philosophy." These words flowed easily, as if she were revealing her deepest thoughts. But in her mind, other intentions were already weaving together. "If I can convince her that I'm on her side, she'll share her secrets with me. I can document it, and then it will all be over." Susan leaned in closer, her expression turning serious. "You know, the more we fight for the truth, the more we get tangled in the web of our own fears. I like that you're starting to understand this. Maybe you'll become my successor." Those words struck a chord with Laura, but she felt she couldn't allow her to subconsciously take over her will. "I want to be like you," she replied, not even realizing how far she was willing to go. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make it happen." In her thoughts, a calculated strategy was forming. To ingratiate herself, become part of this dark game, and then put an end to Susan's horrific deeds. She knew she had to be cautious, but she already felt herself being pulled into this dangerous dance. The next day, Susan caught Laura in an empty hospital corridor as she desperately sought a way to avoid another encounter with her. But Susan appeared unexpectedly, as if she sensed a moment of weakness. In her hands, she held an ampoule of medication and a syringe. Laura noticed a strange smile on her face, cold, detached. "I have a task for you, Laura. It's time to prove your loyalty." Susan's voice was low, but there was no room for refusal. "What is it?" Laura tried to keep her composure, but felt her palms sweating. Susan tossed her the ampoule and syringe. "You need to give Mr. Blake an injection. Nothing complicated. It'll just help him relax. He's suffering from dementia. Why not ease his final days?" Laura froze, as if bound by chains. She knew this patient. Old Mr. Blake was frail but still hanging on despite frequent memory lapses. He wasn't close to death. He was just another case of senile dementia. "This is just a sedative, right?" Laura asked, trying to keep her hands from shaking. Susan smiled faintly. "Of course. Would I lie to you?" Laura felt a heavy dread constricting her lungs. She knew she was trapped, and that any refusal would only worsen her situation. All the other nurses avoided Susan. Those who tried to say anything either suddenly quit or vanished without explanation. In a haze, Laura took the ampoule and syringe and headed to Mr. Blake's room. Everything around her felt blurred. The light from the lamps flickered, and the sound of her footsteps echoed too loudly. When she entered the room, the old man was asleep, breathing heavily. He looked so vulnerable. His skin stretched over his bony frame, and his eyes twitched nervously beneath closed lids. Laura held her gaze on him, hoping to find some reason not to go through with this. But deep down, she knew. Susan wouldn't leave her alone if she didn't comply. With trembling hands, Laura filled the syringe and inserted the needle into Mr. Blake's vein. First, everything was quiet. She exhaled with relief, thinking that it really was just a sedative. Suddenly, he jerked. His eyes flew open, and a rasping sound escaped his mouth. The old man gasped, began to choke, his frail body convulsing as if in a seizure. Laura watched him in horror, paralyzed by fear, unsure of what to do. He gasped for air, trying to inhale, but it seemed his lungs had simply given out. His eyes filled with panic and terror, as if he realized he was about to die. Blood vessels on his face burst, leaving dark splotches. After a few seconds of struggle, everything stopped. Mr. Blake froze in a painful position, eyes wide open. Laura felt her legs buckle beneath her. She couldn't believe it had happened. She had killed a man. "Don't worry, he was doomed anyway," came a voice behind her. Laura turned her head and saw Susan standing in the doorway, watching everything with the same indifferent smile. "Now we share a common secret." Susan stepped closer and placed a hand on Laura's shoulder. "It's all right. This is just the beginning. Now you're part of something bigger, and there's no way out." Laura felt her head spin. She couldn't believe she had become an accomplice. From now on, every attempt to escape could turn catastrophic. Laura sat in her room, contemplating the events of the past few days. She knew that something was wrong in the hospital, but she couldn't yet find a way to prove it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Josh, a colleague who worked alongside Susan. Josh entered the room with an expression that hinted at something sinister. His posture was confident, and Laura felt a cold wave of anxiety wash over her body. "We need to talk," he said, his voice sounding like thunder on a clear day. "About what?" she asked, trying to hide her concern. Josh pulled out his phone and pressed a button. On the screen appeared a video that Laura never wanted to see. She watched anxiously as the recording displayed the moment she injected Mr. Blake, followed by him suddenly gasping for breath. Laura stood frozen in shock, watching the old man die while her hands remained motionless. She closed her eyes, trying to forget, but Josh was not going to stop. "Are you recording?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure. "Recording everything," Josh replied with a smile. "And I know what you did. You can avoid serious trouble if you just comply." A mix of inner fear and rage churned within Laura. "You can't do this," she shouted. "It's illegal." "But I can and I will," Josh said smugly. "You will either cooperate with me, or you'll find yourself in prison for what you've done. I know you don't want that to happen." Laura's thoughts spun in her head. She had to do something. She had already considered calling the police and maybe even trying to slip Josh a sedative to neutralize him and get a confession. That plan seemed appealing, yet dangerous. But soon she realized her plans could be ruined. As Laura pondered, Susan quietly approached the door. "Laura, we need to talk," she said, her voice sounding ominous. Laura felt her heart race. "About what?" she asked, hoping Susan didn't know anything about her plans. Susan smiled, but there was a threat in her eyes. "I know what you're planning, and if you decide to go against me, I'll make sure your dreams of calling the police become your worst nightmares." "I haven't done anything," Laura replied, though her words sounded uncertain. "But you need to choose, Laura," Susan continued, stepping closer. "You can harm another patient under the watch of the cameras, or I will make everyone learn the truth about you." Susan's words opened the door to a horrific choice. Realizing she was trapped, Laura felt the world around her closing in. She was ready to fight, but now understood that the only way out left was to surrender. "Fine," Laura whispered, hating herself for saying those words. "I'll do what you want." Susan smiled, satisfied. "So you made the right choice. No one suspects you yet. And remember, I'm always one step ahead of you." Laura sighed deeply, feeling her soul torn between fear and helplessness. She knew her choice had become heavy and dangerous, but whatever happened next, there was no turning back. Laura stood on the brink, feeling fear creep into her mind. Her heart raced wildly, and her mind struggled between the desire to flee and the unbearable reality awaiting her. Before her stood a child, their bright eyes gazing at her with innocence, unaware of the threat. Laura knew what she had to do. Susan had trapped her, and now she had to harm this defenseless being to save herself. But deep down, she understood that in killing the child, she would kill a part of herself. That thought filled her heart with disdain and hatred. She approached the child, feeling her hands tremble. Each step felt heavy, like a step into the abyss. Laura held the needle in her hand, and though she knew it was just a sedative, her heart thudded with terror. She took a deep breath, trying to collect herself. "It'll be okay, little one," she whispered, trying to sound reassuring, even as panic surged in her chest. "It's just a little prick. You won't even feel a thing." She tried to smile, but it was a strained grin, like a doll performing in a terrifying play. Susan, standing nearby, reminded Laura of the ruthlessness of it all. "Don't embarrass yourself, Laura. You know what to do." Susan's voice sounded like a cold wave washing over her from head to toe. That reminder of the cruelty of the moment pushed Laura deeper into the abyss. She felt her self-hatred rising like a wave ready to destroy her. But from the depths of her soul, a resolute voice awakened. She knew this was just a step toward a greater plan, to bring Susan to justice. As Laura inserted the needle into the child's tender skin, she felt it penetrate deeply into their body, as if piercing her own soul. The child flinched, their eyes filling with despair. Laura wanted to close her eyes but couldn't. She was tethered to this horrific moment. With each subsequent breath, a sense of guilt swelled in her heart. But it was too late. She heard a soft scream escape the child's lips, and in that instant, saw blood trickling from their mouth. The red liquid ran down their cheeks, like testimony to her crime, a sinister sign. Laura stood, stunned, unable to believe she had caused this horror. Voices began to echo in her mind, insisting that she had turned into a monster. Self-hatred peaked as she realized what she had done. Laura squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the horror. But the images remained etched in her memory. The trembling child, the flowing blood, and her own heart tearing apart. "What have I done?" she whispered, but the answer remained silent, as did the fear that enveloped her. She knew she could never undo what had happened. Self-hatred became a massive burden weighing heavily on her shoulders. Laura had lost herself, and now it was not just a loss. It was a true catastrophe. She had become part of the horrific world she once loathed and was now helpless, like someone she had betrayed. Laura decided she would no longer allow horror to define her. She recalled her plan, how she could expose Susan and put an end to this hell. It was her salvation, the only way out of the darkness she had fallen into. And as painful as it was, she needed to do what she had to do to save herself and perhaps save others. Feeling her heart constrict with fear and despair, Laura accepted this horrific reality. She steeled herself for the fight, understanding that sometimes, to destroy evil, you must confront your own. Laura stood tensely in front of Josh, holding a small vial of tranquilizer in her hands. Her heart raced with panic, but she knew she had to act. Concealing the vial in her palm, she called the police, trying to sound calm. "This is Laura Daniels. I have evidence of murders at the hospital. Send someone urgently." Her voice sounded confident, but inside, fear and doubt gripped her. Suddenly, Josh appeared. Laura stood before him, her heart beating in unison with hope and fear. She knew that today it all had to end. Stepping out of the shadows, she discreetly pulled out the small vial of tranquilizer, maintaining a calm expression. Laura knew Josh was Susan's accomplice, but she couldn't let that stop her plan. "You won't be able to call the cops, Laura," he declared defiantly, smiling. Laura slowly approached, as if wanting to express support, and while Josh was occupied talking, she stealthily administered the injection. "This is my revenge for making me kill a child," she whispered, looking him in the eyes. "I know you two are lovers, and now she'll hurt just like I did back then." Josh, sipping from his cup, suddenly began to cough, his face contorted with horror as the drug took effect. "Laura, what did you do?" he whispered, panic in his voice. He grabbed at his throat, his body began to tremble, and Laura watched as his consciousness slowly faded away. In that moment, she was overcome with conflict. She hated herself for becoming part of this horror but couldn't turn back. Blood began to trickle from Josh's mouth, and she saw the terror fill his eyes. Hearing the commotion, Susan rushed into the room, her face a mask of rage. "What have you done, you idiot?" she screamed, noticing Josh collapsing to the floor. As Laura exited the hospital, she thought she had won. She felt the heavy burden of her struggle gradually lifting, leaving only a sense of lightness. But the joy was short-lived. At the exit, police officers awaited her, their figures looming like shadows from hell, closing in on her. "Laura Daniels, you're under arrest for the suspected murders of patients," one of the officers announced, and those words struck her heart like knives. Inside, she froze, feeling all her hopes shatter into pieces. From the dark shadows of the hospital, Susan watched with a cold smile, her eyes sparkling with triumph. "Did you really think you could fool everyone, Laura?" Her voice enveloped Laura like a heavy blanket of horror. The video that Susan had managed to send to news channels turned into a terrible truth. Now Laura looked guilty, trapped in her own snare. She struggled to comprehend how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. As she was placed in the back of the squad car, Laura felt her heart stop in her chest. She saw Susan, her cold smile becoming the most haunting memory. Laura realized that Susan hadn't lost. Her game would continue even from behind bars. In that moment, Laura understood her nightmare was far from over. This was just the beginning of her worst nightmare. She was left with that thought as the light from the car window began to fade, leaving her in darkness, feeling hopeless. Susan had always been one step ahead, and now Laura had become her victim in this deadly game. Let me know what you think of the story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and remember, every secret can rise to the surface.